Good morning, everyone. Welcome to another episode of The Echo Chamber. I'm Echo Wirm, your host for this podcast, and this podcast is one where we go kind of more in-depth and not just read through the books, but talk about the books that we cover on the channel. Now, if you're listening on Spotify or Amazon Music or Apple Podcasts, then you're probably not sure what we're talking about when we talk about the channel. I read audiobooks for a living. You can find all of my readings over on YouTube at Echo Wirm, or Echo Wirm Audiobooks is where we do our daily stuff, which is where this podcast comes from live pretty much every Thursday. We're recording this a little later, but we also have more content that is not available on YouTube, also available for free on Patreon and Vimeo if you just search for Echo Wirm. That's worm spelled with an I. But in this podcast, we are currently going through Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone. Of course, if you're not from the United States, you probably know it as Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone. This is the first book in the Harry Potter series. We've been going a few chapters at a time, just kind of compiling chapters based on the themes that they cover and where they sit kind of in Harry's experience through the world. So, of course, we started with the sole first chapter, and then we did 3 chapters talking about Harry's life in the Muggle world, and the last 3 chapters we talked about were his introduction into the Wizarding world. Where we're sitting now, we're starting chapter 8, called The Potions Master. This is the chapter where Harry starts his school days at Hogwarts. We move on then to chapter 9, which is called The Midnight Duel, and we will close today's podcast talking about chapter 10, Hallowe'en. Now, of course, if you've seen the films, you'll be familiar with kind of the content of most of these chapters. One of them is significantly changed from how it is in the book, but the overlying plot elements are still there. If you've never read this book, we try not to entice spoilers going forward. However, I do kind of make the assumption that if you're listening to this podcast, you will have read at least up to this point, and I may hint at things going forward through the rest of the book. So you don't have to read the rest of the Harry Potter series to know what I'm talking about, but it does help to know where some characters lie at the end of this book, just as we're going forward talking about the analysis. But we finished last episode talking about the sorting hat. Harry finishes his introduction to Hogwarts being sorted into one of 4 houses, the house that he and Ron and their, not necessarily friend, I should say at this point, but their acquaintance from the train, Hermione Granger, are all sorted into Gryffindor House. Gryffindor is housed on a tower on the campus of Hogwarts in the castle called Gryffindor Tower. Of course, if you're familiar with the Hogwarts Legacy game, this is located on one corner of the quad. The castle in the game and the film version is a bit different than it is in the book. The book kind of describes it more as just having an unbelievable amount of towers. It's very all over the place. The castle itself moves around quite a bit and is very much enhanced with magic, for lack of a better phrasing. But we start talking about Harry's school day. Of course, this is early September, 1991 is when this chapter takes place. And in their first day, Harry and Ron run into a lot of problems going forward with their school day, and Harry's narrative talks about it. The stairs move. There are over 100 different staircases in the castle. There are doors that sometimes are doors, sometimes aren't doors. Sometimes you have to tickle them to open them. And then he talks about a character that if you've only ever seen the films, you may not be familiar with, and this character is known as Peeves the Poltergeist. So, in general, especially in Harry Potter, a poltergeist is kind of like a ghost, but it's not the spirit necessarily of a living thing. It's just kind of this atmospheric haunting that exists. It's not really a living creature, if you could even consider ghosts living creatures. It is a sentient haunting of the castle. They have tried on several occasions to remove it in the 1,000-year history of Hogwarts, but it's never been successful. And so Peeves is kind of this sentient, ethereal being that not just haunts the castle, but pulls pranks on it. He's kind of the school prankster that never leaves, will never graduate, because he's just constantly there. He's been there for several centuries, and is always playing tricks on the students, is always playing tricks on Argus Filch, the caretaker. And Harry and Ron mention that they would much rather get lost in the castle through a staircase than be stopped by Peeves, because Peeves will do everything in his power to burden you with the way that you're going about your day. So they're late for class on a couple different occasions. Of course, we see this in the film. McGonagall makes fun of them for not being able to find their way around. But they go around to their different classes. We talked a little bit about the different classes in Harry Potter in our last few episodes, but you have things like Defense Against the Dark Arts. You have Transfiguration with Professor McGonagall, where you transfigure items into living beings, or living beings into items, or items into other items. You have Charms with Professor Flitwick, where you just work on your basic charming spells. Those are kind of the big ones. I'm sure I'm missing a couple, but the one to touch on in this chapter, and the one that gives this chapter its name, is Potions. Now, Potions is currently taught by a professor named Severus Snape, and Professor Snape is a character who Harry has never really met, but got some odd vibes from in the previous chapter. He was watching Professor Snape up at the head table during the sorting ceremony when his scar began to hurt for the first time. And so he's got a bad vibe about him with Snape. And finally, they go to Potions class. It's a double Potions class with the Slytherins. And Snape, being the head of Slytherin House, he's kind of like their not necessarily counselor, but their head teacher that kind of sides with them on most things. He's kind of their coordinator as well as being a teacher, the same way that Professor McGonagall is for Gryffindor. And so Snape already favors the Slytherins. And as soon as Harry walks into the classroom, Snape begins to target Harry specifically and calls him the new celebrity and is basically putting him front and center, trying to embarrass him in any way he can. Now, of course, I'm not going to spoil why he does these things. This is a major plot development going on further in the series. But the big thing to note, and if you've read the full series, you're going to understand the subtext that I'm hinting at here. But like I said, I won't spoil Snape's motivations this early on. We'll talk about it way later on in the series. But the interaction that he has with Harry is kind of interesting. He asks three main questions to Harry. Of course, Harry, not coming from the wizarding world, has no idea what any of these questions mean. Hermione does, because Hermione, despite having grown up in the Muggle world, has read up on all of things magical. She is obscenely studious. She is ready to answer any questions that come her way. And so the first question that Snape asks Harry, and I might be butchering the phrasing on these because I'm not actually looking at my copy of the book, but the first one, he asks what would happen if he mixes asphodel and wormwood. Second question he asks, what is a bezoar? The third question he asks, what is the difference between monkshood and wolfsbane? And these three questions are very interesting. Let's work backwards through them. So the last one, the difference between monkshood and wolfsbane, he does explain that they're the same plant. Now, the reason he's asking about these is very interesting. Go back, he talks about the bezoar. The bezoar is a stone from the stomach of a goat, which is used to cure most poisons. It's kind of an emergency EpiPen, for lack of a better term. It literally operates as like an EpiPen for poison. And then the first question, what would happen if he mixes asphodel and wormwood? That is essentially the two main ingredients in the Draught of Living Death, which is a death potion, essentially, or more like a Sleeping Beauty potion. It's interesting to note, this isn't a plot spoiler going forward. I won't incite the scenarios in which these things occur. But in the 6th book, in Half-Blood Prince, all three of these things are used very, very specifically and very, very prominently. Draught of the Living Death shows up as kind of a plot point in Half-Blood Prince. So does the use of a bezoar, and so does monkshood and wolfsbane, kind of tangentially at the end of the book. So it's interesting to see that all three of these things, which are major potion elements in Half-Blood Prince, are kind of foreshadowed in this conversation. But in this conversation, and in bringing this up with Harry, fans have noted the first of these questions, with the wording of asphodel and wormwood. And this is where we get kind of tinfoily. So Harry Potter is one of those books. I love Harry Potter because it's one of those books that rewards you for rereading it. The series is written from a very analytical perspective. It's still got the hero's journey, it's still got the mystery thing, but there's underlying elements that the more you read it, the more you kind of understand things that are going on. And I've read this book I bet you I've read this book 50 times. And each time there's something new in this book that pops out and strikes me. And this interaction, fans have kind of gone out of their way to make it into something that may or may not actually be there. I don't know if J.K. Rowling really intended this. But there exists in horticulture, or botany, something called the Victorian flower language. And if you have no idea what I'm talking about, that's okay. But put on your tinfoil hats for a second, and let's talk about what Snape's first words mean. The Victorian flower language was apparently a way of speaking between botanists that combined poetry with botany during Victorian times, so about 200 years ago, a little less than 200 years ago, where in all kind of the romanticization of nature when it came to writing and when it came to poetry, people, especially people working with plants like botanists, would use certain plants to evoke certain emotions, or when poets would write, they would use certain plants to elicit certain emotions. And when it comes to these two specific plants, asphodel and wormwood, the powdered root of asphodel in the Victorian flower language is a plant that symbolizes regret, and just kind of this otherworldly regret that cannot be salvaged or cannot be forgiven, essentially. And wormwood is a plant that also kind of represents regret and specifically the absence of something. So loss and not able to ever come to terms with said loss. And it's also interesting to note that asphodel is a type of lily. Now that is very important if you want to kind of combine all the elements of what Snape may or may not be saying in this. But he's talking about a lily plant and about regret and how he will never get over the loss of something which he regrets losing. And that's all I'll leave at, because if I go any further with it, for those of you that have not read the rest of the series, you will not understand what I'm talking about. We'll readdress this in Deathly Hallows when we come back and we talk about the big spoilers going forward. But this is kind of a tinfoil theory that fans have talked about Snape's first interaction with Harry, the deeper meaning of the words that he's coming across. And if you don't believe that, that's totally fine. I'm one of those people who thinks that this theory is a little bit reachy. I don't think that J.K. Rowling was super into Victorian flower language when she was trying to write this scene. I think it's just a way to portray this teacher bullying students for no better purpose than to feel better about his own ego, which is kind of Snape's character going forward, as we'll see in later books, and talk about kind of the deeper motivations behind that as we move into something like Prisoner of Azkaban, move into something like Order of the Phoenix, and we really start to understand Snape's backstory with this. So Snape embarrasses Harry in front of the class, and Harry really starts to feel like he knows nothing about the wizarding world. He's not a good student, he's not a good magician or wizard, or however you want to put it. He is very far behind everybody else because of his experiences growing up in the Muggle world. He is really struggling to fit in at Hogwarts. Now, we do end this chapter on a bit of a lighter note, maybe a bit more of a mysterious note. But about halfway through his day, Harry gets a letter from Hagrid, who invites him down to his hut. He's got this kind of, you'll recognize it from the films. He's got this hut that exists outside the castle somewhere. It's a different place in every film, so it's not really consistent. But it's kind of down the hill from the main lawn is how it's described in the book. Hagrid lives on the campus of Hogwarts and invites Harry to tea after school. And Harry brings Ron along, and Ron gets to meet Hagrid officially for the first time. And when they're down at Hagrid's hut, Harry implies to Hagrid that Snape hates him. Not just implies, he basically says it outright. He goes, I don't think Snape likes me very much. And Hagrid's like, oh, that's baloney. That's he has no right to hate you. He doesn't even know you, kind of thing. Now, of course, those of us who have read the full series understand Snape's motivations for bullying his students and specifically going after Harry. But Hagrid kind of shoves it off. And then the chapter ends with a bit of a mystery, where Harry is reading the newspaper, the Daily Prophet, which is the wizarding newspaper, and he notices that there was a robbery at Gringotts the day that he was there. So basically, if you go back to the chapter where Harry and Hagrid go and get his money out of the vault, and they go to Vault 713, apparently someone broke into Gringotts within a few hours of them being there, trying to break into Vault 713. But it had already been cleared out. And so this is kind of we talked about the first big mystery with Harry Potter. This is a mystery novel. This is kind of the big mystery of this specific book going forward, is what was in Vault 713 and what is going on. Why is someone trying to steal it? But what Harry's wondering at this point is, someone tried to break in and steal something that Hagrid already took. What did Hagrid take? And what is hiding in the castle that is so valuable? And so that's at the back of our minds as we finish the first of these 3 chapters that we're covering today. So that is chapter 8, The Potions Master. Now we move on to chapter 9, and this one is called The Midnight Duel. The reason it's called The Midnight Duel is because there's supposed to be a duel at midnight. Now, if you've only ever seen the films, you'll be like, I don't remember that from the film. I remember maybe the dueling scene in Chamber of Secrets. This is not related to that, although Malfoy is involved. But this is a scene that was significantly changed in its background going forward into the films. So you'll recall in the films, at this point, Hermione has kind of started tailing Ron and Harry. In the books, it's not that way. In the books, it's very much Harry and Ron against the world. It is just the two of them. Hermione is not their friend. Neville is not really their friend. They're really just classmates. But in the films, Hermione has started to tail them. And they get lost on the staircase because the staircases move, and they find themselves in the 3rd floor corridor. That is completely different from the setup of this chapter. However, the chapters end the same in both film and book. So going back to the book, we pick up here and find out that they have flying class starting very soon. Now, flying is not a class that really ever reappears in the books. It's kind of if you think later on in the series, they do things like apparition class, where it's kind of this short-term, like quarter-long or semester-long class to learn how to do a very specific skill, and then you never have to learn it again. Flying is a class that is offered to these first years. Not really offered, they're kind of forced to do it, just to learn how to do it. But it's taught by a professor named Rolanda Hooch. And Professor Hooch, or Madame Hooch, is portrayed in the films by Zoe Wanamaker. And she's kind of this weird... She almost looks like a hawk, like quite literally looks like a hawk, is described as having like yellowish predatory eyes. And they go to flying class, and that's how this starts. They're out in the grounds, and Harry finally finds the first bit of magic that he's actually good at. His broom, when he calls to it, you'll remember the up scene from the film, where they're all trying to get their brooms off the ground, and Harry is kind of the first person to get his broom to come to him. The one thing that Harry always has over everybody else in the wizarding world is he's a very good flyer. And he gets that from his dad, as we learn later on in this chapter. Or rather, in future chapters. That's not a major spoiler. But Harry learns that he's very good at flying. In this chapter, when they're trying to get their brooms off the ground, or they're trying to learn how to fly, Neville Longbottom has a bit of an episode where his broom kind of takes off without him. He has no control over it, and he basically flies up into the air without permission and falls, not to his death, but he pretty much shatters his arm. So he is pretty wounded during this flying class, and Madame Hooch rather, takes him to the hospital wing, basically tells the students to just stay still, and this is where we get Draco Malfoy picking up Neville's Remember-All. This is basically verbatim in the film. It's a very good scene in the film. But Malfoy steals Neville's Remember-All, which is this little device that Neville's grandmother had gotten him. Is kind of been his prized possession that he's been carrying around. And Malfoy steals it because Neville left it behind when they went to the hospital wing. And Draco Malfoy kind of makes a big scene of, if you want it back, come get me. And he flies off without permission. Harry goes off and chases him, despite Ron and Hermione kind of saying, let's not do this, don't do this, you're going to get expelled, whatever. Harry follows him into the sky, and Malfoy throws the Remember-All, and Harry goes and dives and gets it and comes back down, and McGonagall is waiting for him. Now, McGonagall watched him catch this Remember-All, and she basically storms off with Harry and says, come with me, and Harry's thinking the whole time, oh my gosh, I'm going to get expelled. I've been here for 2 weeks, and I'm already getting expelled. And then she brings him to the Defense Against the... I can't remember how it is in the books. In the films, it's the Defense Against the Dark Arts room. It actually, off the top of my head, if I remember right, it might be Charms that she takes him to. That's not really important. But she takes him to a specific classroom, has him wait out in the hallway, and then she brings out a student named Oliver Wood. Now, Oliver Wood is the captain of the Gryffindor Quidditch team. And all of a sudden, McGonagall basically changes on a dime, and her attitude goes, you're the greatest seeker I've ever seen. I want you to play Quidditch for Gryffindor. And everyone's like, what? What's going on here? Because up to this point, as far as we know, first years are not allowed to play Quidditch. For a very specific reason. But McGonagall, being the head of house, has seen the skill that Harry has and has determined that it is in the best interest for both him as a positive flyer and her house to put a first year on the team. And so they meet with Oliver Wood. Oliver Wood says, sure, if Professor McGonagall thinks you're good enough, then you're going to join the team. We'll have Quidditch tryouts sometime very soon. Or not necessarily tryouts, but we'll have a little practice so you can learn the game. Because obviously Harry is from the Muggle world. He has no idea how Quidditch works. And so Wood is going to teach him. And then it turns out that Harry has been named the youngest first-year seeker in a century. And Draco Malfoy is shocked by this and just peeved about this. Because if he hadn't thrown the Remember-All, Harry wouldn't have become the new star Quidditch player. Now, keep in mind, Quidditch hasn't really happened yet. There hasn't been a match. Harry hasn't shown anybody his skill. He's just been named to the team. But it's still a huge deal, and Malfoy is absolutely pissed about it. And so, thinking that Harry would be expelled, and now seeing him celebrated for it, Malfoy challenges Harry to a wizarding duel. And this is where the chapter changes significantly from book to film. And so Draco Malfoy challenges Harry Potter to a midnight duel. They're going to sneak out of their common rooms and duel up in the trophy room. And Ron agrees to be Harry's second, which is basically his backup in case he dies in the duel. It played for kind of laughs in the book. But Ron goes with Harry, and they break out of the common room. And what happens is, as they're breaking out of the common room, they trip over Neville. Now, Neville had been released from the hospital wing that night and made his way back to Gryffindor Tower, but he couldn't remember the password. And this is kind of a recurring gag with Neville throughout the series, is that he cannot remember passwords. He is terrible at just remembering anything, which is why he had the Remember-All in the first place. But he's sleeping out in the hallway. Him waking up wakes up Hermione, who is waiting for them, because she knows that they're going to sneak out. She overheard it. And so all four of them then go off to watch Harry essentially duel with Malfoy and probably get expelled for this too. And so the biggest change here is that Neville goes with them. Because keep in mind, the trio that we think of with Harry Potter, with Harry, Ron, and Hermione, is not in effect yet. They're not friends yet. And so Harry and Ron are going off, and they're being followed now by Hermione and Neville, who simply doesn't want to be alone. And so they go off, they go up to the trophy room. The trophy room, we see it in the film, but we really never see it after the first film. But it's this location where all these trophies are being held. The history of Hogwarts is teams and competitions with other schools and that sort of thing. So they sneak out, they go to the trophy room, and then they wait there, and they keep waiting there, and then they start to realize that Draco Malfoy is not coming to this duel. And they are out of bed after hours, and they've been set up. Malfoy wanted them to get expelled because he failed the first time, and so he basically tipped off Mr. Filch, the caretaker, and his cat that these students are going to sneak out of bed, so you should capture them. So they're in the trophy room, and they start to hear Mrs. Norris, the cat, and they start freaking out, and they start flying down the hallway, and they're running as fast as they can to get back to Gryffindor Tower. Now, it's implied in the chapter that Gryffindor Tower is basically on the entire opposite side of the castle from the trophy room, and so they are trying to get as far away from the trophy room as possible. But they get lost because they're freaking out. They are doing their best not to be captured, and they make their way to a locked door at kind of this dead end. And this is where things kind of return to the way the films portray it. So in the films, of course, it's the staircases moving, but in this chapter, it's them running from Filch, having been set up by Malfoy. And the four of them, including Neville, break into this locked door, and then they start to realize that they're on the third floor. And the third floor is home to what has been set up in previous chapters as off limits. There is something going on the third floor where Dumbledore has deemed it off limits to all students. And they realize very shortly why, because as soon as they break into the third floor corridor to try to escape from Filch, they realize that inside the room is a massive three-headed dog. Now, of course, this is a reference to Cerberus in Greek mythology. If you're familiar with Harry Potter, you'll recall, or excuse me, Percy Jackson, you'll recall Cerberus is kind of the guard dog of the underworld. And so there's some interesting parallels with Greek mythology here where, of course, they learn that this dog is standing on a trapdoor. Hermione's the only one that notices it. But it's guarding something. And of course, if you go by Greek mythology, it's guarding the underworld. And so the question here is, what is being protected in the underworld of Hogwarts? There's something hidden under the castle. And this is where Harry kind of starts, and you as the reader will kind of start to piece together, okay, maybe he's guarding the thing that Hagrid stole. Somehow they escape from the dog, somehow they escape from Filch, and that's how the chapter ends. So we're 2 chapters through this. Now we move on to chapter 10, Hallowe'en. And this is another chapter that you'll recall from the film. Very, very much exactly as it is in the book. And of course, when we start the next chapter, Harry and Ron are desperate to just talk about what happened. They're like, there's a three-headed dog in the castle. We weren't supposed to be there. It's guarding something. Hermione thinks there was a trapdoor under it. It's got to be guarding something. And Hermione, and Neville specifically, as soon as they make their way back to the common room, never want to talk about this. And again, Malfoy sees them the next day and is just peeved that they're not expelled. Malfoy is doing everything in his power to kind of thwart them, and they continue to thwart his own plans at thwarting them. And everybody is mad at each other. And the tension's broken by a gift that arrives to Harry. Harry receives his first big mail package. It's a broomstick. Now, in the films, it's kind of hinted that it's McGonagall who sends him this broomstick. In the books, it's very clearly sent from McGonagall. But Professor McGonagall basically spends her house budget on a brand new broomstick for Harry. Essentially paid for then back by the money that Harry's parents have. But she buys him a top-of-the-line broomstick called the Nimbus 2000. Draco Malfoy is further peeved about this. Everything that happens to Harry is good, and Malfoy doesn't want it to be good. And Malfoy continues to be jealous of just the luck and the admiration that people have for Harry. In Charms class, then, or actually, I'm skipping ahead here. That evening in this chapter, we have the first Quidditch practice. So this is where we get Oliver Wood taking Harry out to the grounds to practice Quidditch. It's a bit more eventful than it is in the film. They cut it down a little bit in the film. But they practice Quidditch. Harry learns about the different rules of Quidditch, the different balls of Quidditch, the different positions of Quidditch. And then they practice with golf balls, which I think is kind of fun, where instead of using actual golden snitches, which have sentience and can fly around or whatever, Wood basically just takes muggle golf balls and throws them through the air, having Harry go and get them. Next day, we have Charms. Charms is a class that is taught by a little professor called Professor Flitwick. Of course, in the films, he's always played by the same actor, but they changed his design for the third film. And then when they brought the character back, they decided to keep the new design rather than go back to the original design. It's kind of an interesting behind-the-scenes story of why they changed the look of Flitwick. But Professor Flitwick is played by Warwick Davis in the films, and he's this short little, almost hinted at to be a dwarf or an elf of sort, kind of like a mixed descent. But he teaches the class a new charm called Wingardium Leviosa. Everyone knows this scene. This is the scene where Ron is pronouncing things incorrectly, and Hermione corrects him on it. And so Hermione is very condescending toward Ron. He gets really, really ticked off about this. And as they're walking out of the class, he is basically taunting Hermione out loud, not realizing that she can hear him, but making fun of her in a way that is incredibly condescending to her, and basically causes her to have a breakdown. Because she already kind of feels like an outsider. Harry, all of his kind of unnervedness at the Wizarding World because he grew up in the Muggle world is kind of abated by the fact that he has Ron by his side. Ron has really taken to Harry, and so Harry has someone to confide in, whereas Hermione, who, despite being very good at all of this academic work, doesn't have any friends. And so she kind of has this breakdown. She fails to show up at dinner that night. It's the big Halloween feast. And then Professor Quirrell breaks in. And this is where we get the famous scene, "Troll, troll in the dungeon! Thought you ought to know." And then he passes out. And all hell breaks loose in Hogwarts. There's this huge just fit of mayhem going through. And they're being escorted back to the common room by Percy. And Harry and Ron realize that Hermione has no idea that there is a troll in the castle. And they don't know where she is. They assume she's in one of the bathrooms because they overhear, I think it's Parvati Patil, talking about where Hermione was last seen or last heard. And so they disappear. They continue to break the rules, which is very fun kind of character quirks that both of these main characters do. They are always breaking rules, constantly. And so they disappear from the herd. They disappear from the common room and go down to one of the girls' bathrooms to find Hermione. And they basically, what happens is they see the troll first. They're in the same area of the castle that they think Hermione's in, and they see a troll, and they see this troll go into a room, and they lock the troll in, and they think they've won. Then they hear screaming, and they realize that the room that they've just locked the troll in is the women's bathroom that Hermione is hiding in. And so they break back into the women's bathroom. They go in there, and then we get the scene that we see in the film where they basically outsmart this troll by using the... first of all, Harry attacks the troll, and then Ron successfully uses Wingardium Leviosa to knock out the troll. Then the troll's knocked out cold, they save Hermione, and then the teachers come in. And Hermione lies to the teachers about what happened, and says that she was being attacked, which isn't necessarily untrue, but the context is kind of where the lie comes in here. But Hermione basically protects the boys, and Hermione loses house points, Harry and Ron win house points, and basically just kind of show their heroism for the first time to all of these teachers. And that's how the chapter ends. And the last line, let me see if I can find it here. It might take me a bit. So I'll try not to keep you guys with dead air, but if we go to the very end of the chapter, the final paragraph, it's one of my favorite lines in the whole book. It says, "But from that moment on, Hermione Granger became their friend. There are some things you can't share without ending up liking each other, and knocking out a 12-foot mountain troll is one of them." And so it's this really cool moment, which we don't quite get in the films, where up to this point, Hermione was not their friend. She was just their classmate. They were both parties kind of annoyed each other. But it basically says that because of their shared trauma and their shared experience, they became friends. They had to. It was one of those experiences that they couldn't get over without becoming friends. And that's how we end not just this chapter, but for the podcast, this set of 3 chapters. And I love this section of the book. I really do, because it's such an interesting insight into new characters, the new world that Harry and Ron are surrounded by, and just setting up mystery plot points and friendships and antagonists and Malfoy and stuff like that. And it's a really fantastic set of chapters here. So those are chapters 8, 9, and 10 of Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone, or Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone. If you guys want to ask, if you have any questions or things that you want talked about on the podcast regarding these chapters or chapters coming up or chapters that we've talked about before, if you're listening on a podcast station, whether it be Apple Podcasts or Spotify or any of those, you're more than welcome to email them into echowyrm@gmail.com. Of course, that's worm spelled with an I. If you're listening live or later on YouTube, you are more than welcome to leave comments down below, and we will cover them on the podcast as well. If you guys don't know where to find us, I talked a little earlier about looking for Echo Wirm or Echo Wirm Audiobooks on YouTube. We have 2 separate channels. One has our kind of full compilation videos of all of our different audiobooks, and one is a daily upload chapter, a daily chapter upload channel. You can also find us on Patreon. We have a lot of material for free, but we also have several things that are in advance of the YouTube channel by about 2 months if you want to go there. Everything's available for $3 or more a month, but like I said, we have plenty of free content, including all of our Harry Potter recordings. We have all of the audiobooks. If you ever want to listen along to these chapters or listen to them before you listen to the podcast, you're more than welcome to do so. Those are available for free on Patreon or Vimeo. Just search for Echo Wirm. Again, worm with an I. Next week, 2 weeks, we talk about Quidditch. And we talk about going forward into the latter half of the book. We are over halfway through Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone now. And of course, then we will move on throughout the rest of the series and continue to talk Harry Potter going forward. Thank you guys very much for joining me today. I hope you have an excellent rest of your morning or afternoon or evening, wherever you are when you're listening to this. Thank you very much.